The Congressional Budget Office released its annual Budget and Economic Outlook report on Capitol Hill this afternoon. The report projects that by 2028, federal debt would equal the nation's gross domestic product. CBO Director Keith Hall and Assistant Director for Tax Analysis John McClellan spoke to reporters. This is a half hour.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO. I thought before we answer questions, I'd read a brief statement. But as you know, we've just released our annual Budget and Economic Outlook for this time for 2018 to 2028. And I'll start with a brief statement, if that's okay. In the Congressional Budget Office's baseline projections, which incorporate the assumption that current laws governing taxes and spending generally remain unchanged, the federal budget deficit grows substantially over the next few years. Later on, between 2023 and 2028, it stabilizes in relation to the size of the economy, though at a high level. As a result, federal debt is projected to be on a steadily rising trajectory throughout the decade, approaching 100% of GDP by 2028. Since I'm an economist, we have to give you a picture. There we go. Projected deficits over the 2018-2027 period have increased markedly since we issued our last budget and economic projections in June of 2017. The increase stems primarily from taxes and spending legislation enacted since then, especially the 2017 Tax Act, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018. In our economic projections, which underlie our budget projections, inflation-adjusted GDP, or real GDP, expands by 3.3% this year and by 2.4% in 2019. Most of this growth is driven by consumer spending and business investment, but federal spending also contributes a significant amount this year. The growth of real GDP exceeds the growth of real potential GDP over the next 2 years. This marked cyclical path in real GDP will occur in large part because recent legislation provides significant fiscal stimulus at a time when there is very little slack in the economy. Those effects, as well as the larger federal budget deficits resulting from the new laws, exert upward pressure on interest rates and prices. During the 2020 to 2026 period, those factors, along with the slower growth in federal outlays and the expiration of reductions in personal income taxes, dampen economic growth. After 2026, economic growth is projected to rise slightly, matching the growth rate of potential output by 2028. Between 2018 and 2028, real actual output and real potential output alike are projected to expand at an average annual rate of 1.9%. In our forecast, the growth of potential GDP is the key determinant of the growth of actual GDP through 2028, because actual output is very near its potential level now and is projected to be near its potential level at the end of the period. Potential output is projected to grow more quickly than it has since the start of the 2007 to 2009 recession, as the growth of productivity increases to nearly its average over the past 25 years. Nonetheless, potential output is projected to grow more slowly than it did earlier in the decades, held down by slower growth of labor force, which results partially from the ongoing retirement of baby boomers. In our projections, the effects of the 2017 Tax Act on incentives to work, save, and invest raise real potential GDP through the 2018 to 2028 period. Over the same period, the Tax Act is projected to boost the level of real GDP by an average of 0.7% and non-farm payroll employment by an average of 1.1 million jobs. Our current economic projections differ from those that we made in June of 2017 in a number of ways. The most significant is that the potential and actual real GDP are projected to grow more quickly over the next few years. Projected output is greater because of recent enacted legislation, data that became available after our previous economic projections were completed, and improvements in our analytical methods. Over the next decade, the unemployment rate is lower in our current projections than in our previous ones, particularly during the next few years when economic stimulus boosts demand for labor. Also, both short and long-term interest rates are projected to be higher on average from 2018 to 2023. Turning to the budget projections, we estimate that the 2018 deficit will total $804 billion, $139 billion more than the $665 billion shortfall recorded in 2017. In our projections, budget deficits continue increasing after 2018. As deficits accumulate, debt held by the public rises from 78% of GDP, or $16 trillion, at the end of 2018 to 96% of GDP, or $29 trillion, by 2018. That percentage would be the largest since 1946 and well more than twice the average over the past 5 decades. For the next few years, revenues hover near their 2018 level of 16.6% of GDP in our projections. Then they rise steadily, reaching 17.5% of GDP by 2025. At the end of that year, many provisions of the 2017 Tax Act expire, causing receipts to rise sharply to 18.1% of GDP in 2016 and 18.5% in 2017 and 2018. They have averaged 17.4% of GDP over the past 50 years. In our projections, outlays for the next 3 years remain near 21% of GDP, which is higher than their average of 20.3% over the past 50 years. After that, outlays grow more quickly than the economy does. That increase reflects significant growth in mandatory spending, mainly because the aging of the population and rising healthcare costs per beneficiary are projected to increase spending for Social Security and Medicare, among other programs. It also reflects significant growth in interest costs, which are projected to grow more quickly than any other major component of the budget, the result of rising interest rates and mounting debt. By 2028, net outlays for interest are projected to be roughly triple what they are this year in dollar terms, and roughly double when measured as a percentage of GDP. In contrast, discretionary spending is projected to decline in relation to the size of the economy. For the 2018 to 2027 period, we now project a cumulative deficit that is $1.6 trillion larger than the $10.1 trillion that we anticipated in June. Projected revenues are lower by $1 trillion and projected outlays are higher by $0.5 trillion. Laws enacted since June of 2017, above all the 3 mentioned earlier, are estimated to make the cumulative deficit $2.7 trillion larger than previously projected between 2018 and 2027. However, revisions to our economic projections caused us to reduce our estimate of the cumulative deficit by $1 trillion over the same period, mainly because of expectations of faster growth in the economy and in wages and corporate profits. Other changes had relatively small net effects on projections. CBO also analyzed an alternative scenario in which current law was altered to maintain major policies that are now in place, so that substantial tax increases and spending cuts would not take place as scheduled under current law, and to provide more typical amounts of emergency funding than the sums provided for 2018. In that scenario, far larger deficits and much greater debt would result than in CBO's current baseline projections. Debt held by the public would reach about 105% of GDP by the end of 2028, an amount that has been exceeded only once in the nation's history. However, the pressures contributing to that rise would accelerate and push debt up even more sharply in subsequent decades. Such high and rising debt would have serious negative consequences for the budget and the nation. In particular, the likelihood of a fiscal crisis in the United States would increase. I'd can now answer some questions. We have some smart people who worked on the report on the sides, and I'd like to ask maybe John McClellan, wherever he is, to come join me to help answer questions. John is the head of our tax analysis division. So if you don't mind, would you please state your name and news organization when asking your question? Yes.
Paul Krozak, Congressional Quarterly. There used to be sort of a rule of thumb that over the previous 40 years, revenue had averaged 18% and spending had averaged 20%. But now, over the next 10 years, you're saying it's revenue 17% and spending 20%. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And do you know at what point that changed and why it changed? Spending has stayed about the same, but it looks like, well, but over the past 50 years, revenue has dropped from 18 to 17 average.
Well, actually, the recent drop, of course, was the Tax Act, right? And we expect that the revenue projections are going to grow back to above their 50-year historical average by the end of the 10-year period. So we'll get back to higher than normal revenue levels.
Did the Great Recession play a part in reducing past revenues, which helped bring the past average from 18% to 17%?
Yeah, that seems likely true. There's a real cyclical aspect to revenues and spending. In fact, the Great Recession, I think, actually over doubled the size of the debt in 5 quick years, and that was from lower revenues and higher spending that are sort of natural during a business cycle. And that actually reminds me, if you don't mind, let me go back to a picture here, because one of the things about this picture I'd like to not be missed. And it's the business cycle aspect of this. You notice that at time periods, this is the deficit. At time periods where the deficit is getting high are all during business cycles at the end of recessions. Right? You always have this big significant increase. Right? We're well away from the last recession, and we're starting from a very high level. So any more business cycle activity that comes up starting from this high level is likely to push the deficit to quite high levels above what we're forecasting right now. In case I hadn't depressed you enough. Yes.
Joe Lawler, Washington Examiner. Can I ask about your interest rate forecast? And on the one hand, if I understand correctly, it's a little bit higher than the Fed's own, the median projection that they put out from their monetary policy committee.
Right.
And why would that be? And are you worried about being consistently high and maybe having that affect your debt projections over the window? Also, is there anything that is on the horizon or that could make those rise much more quickly, changing the overall picture? In specific, tariffs have been in the news a lot. Is the prospects, for instance, of a big foreign investor like China dumping their bonds?
Well, first of all, one of the reasons that we've actually upped our forecast of interest rates pretty significantly since June of 2017 is because we've just had a great deal of fiscal stimulus on an economy that's nearly out of slack. So we expect it's going to do, although we're going to have a nice jump. I'll do a picture here. A jump in GDP above potential. We're going to pay for that because it's above potential. We expect there'll be pressure on prices, on inflation, and interest rates. And so we expect the Fed will accelerate their increase in interest rates. And that's actually part of what we're seeing here with a slowdown in the GDP forecast. So we do see federal funds rate. It's at about 1.75 right now. We expect it to go up to about 2.5% by the end of this year, by about 3.5% by the end of next year. It's because we expect the Fed will have to deal with these inflationary pressures. And you're right, kind of the focus on interest rates, because interest rates are one of the more uncertain parts of our forecast. We have such a high debt level that a little bit higher interest rate, a little bit lower interest rate than we're projecting makes a real difference in the interest cost that the federal government experiences. We obviously what we've done is we forecast, because of the legislative changes, we expect interest rates to accelerate faster than we did before, and get to a same sort of relatively high level that we expected all along. It's just we think it's going to accelerate things faster. But again, as you mentioned, if interest rates are higher or lower, that will make a pretty big impact on where we are with respect to debt in 10 years. Things like tariffs and et cetera, we haven't had a chance to really look at that much. I know we've got tariffs now on steel, new tariffs on steel and aluminum. Those really aren't in our forecast. That sort of thing could affect GDP growth. But that'll be part of our next baseline, is the sort of be included, I guess, in our economic forecast. Yes.
So just to clarify, the likelihood of higher interest rates is why you believe GDP will fall below potential, around 2020, 2021, et cetera.
That's right.
Okay. And when was the last time that the economy hit 105% of debt to GDP ratio?
Immediately after World War II. So it's a rather special time period. And again, I say that the timing of this is really concerning, because we're not coming out of a recession. We're quite a few years off a recession, and we have very high deficits. Yes.
There's a number in the report that suggests that the cumulative deficit impact of the tax law specifically is 1.9 trillion, and that's a number that's quite higher than the other nonpartisan estimates I've seen. So, what explains that discrepancy, or how you arrived at that number?
Well, sure. A few things about this. It's different from the good work that JCT did when they did an estimate of the tax effect, because we're dealing with a different 10-year time period. We're a year earlier. We have a different economic forecast. We're working off a different baseline. And I can tell you that the economic effect, we're kind of right in the middle with other folks in terms of the economic impact on things. So I don't know if we're higher or lower than other folks, but the 1.9 trillion comes from about 2.3 trillion in direct increase in the deficit from the legislation, and then economic growth will take off about $460 billion of that deficit increase. So that's sort of where we get to where we are. Yes.
I've read a lot of these reports in the past, and you have a tendency to talk about the dangers of the deficit in the same language over and over again, even though the deficits have been getting higher. And you haven't really sort of sounded more alarmist, but here's your opportunity. How much worse is the fiscal picture now in the wake of this burst of legislation? Particularly if that legislation is extended under your alternative scenario. And when you say that it increases the likelihood of a fiscal crisis, does it also increase the likelihood that fiscal crisis would occur earlier?
Well, first of all, one of the difficulties we have is nobody knows what's too much debt, what will cause a fiscal crisis. It really depends upon the country, depends upon the situation. The real key, of course, is whether people are still willing to loan the federal government money when the government continues to borrow. So the one thing we can say, and we do try to say, is the bigger the debt, the bigger the chances of a fiscal crisis. And with respect to timing, I think one of the most important things about the timing is when do you start to fix something like this? The longer you wait, the more draconian the measures have to be to fix the problem. The earlier you start to tackle it, the less draconian the measures can be. That's the biggest warning, I think, that we've got with this, is if you continue to ignore it, you're going to have you're going to require economic policy to make some more dramatic, Congress to make some more dramatic changes to fix the problem later on. Yes.
Now, the Asahi Shimbun today. So the GDP growth is projected to be much lower than the President Trump, the Trump administration has expected. So would you tell me a little bit more about the potential negative impacts of tax cuts during the period when unemployment rate is already low?
Okay. Well, the difficulty, the tricky part for right now, in terms of the economics, is to have so much stimulus at a time when there's very little slack in the economy. There is some effect, certainly from the tax bill, that raises potential GDP. And by the way, when we say potential GDP, we're talking about the supply side of the economy. There's some increases to potential GDP, but there's more stimulus that pushes GDP above potential, right? And that's the thing that becomes tricky over the next few years, because if we have GDP above potential, then we've got to anticipate that we're going to have a soft landing at some point, because there's going to be pressure on prices and interest rates. Yes.
Kind of a follow-up from Andy's question. So after 1946, the debt was more than 100% of GDP. By 2028, it would be approaching that. What is the difference between what the outlook was back in 1946, looking ahead? How was the debt and the fiscal situation different compared to where we will be in 2028 with that amount of debt?
I think that the single most important difference is that debt will be high and rising. Our forecast beyond 10 years does nothing but show rising debt to GDP ratio. And we anticipate within the next decade after that we're going to break the record under current law of debt to GDP. So we're getting to really quite high levels, and there's really no trend path under current law to fix the problem. That's the biggest difference, I think.
And do you guys weigh in on the best policy solution for addressing that problem? I know there was some debate today with some former CEA chairs saying it's not about cutting entitlement spending, it's about perhaps not cutting taxes at this moment in time. I mean, do you guys, is there a policy prescription that you guys would say is more beneficial than others?
We would go out of our way not to make a policy prescription, except to say that Congress has got some tough decisions to make about how to deal with this problem, and they've got some options. One of the things I think that's going to be really important, if you sort of look ahead at 10 years from now, just the net interest cost. Right, the annual cost of interest payments will exceed total non-defense discretionary spending in 10 years. So you're getting at a level where just the interest cost is getting to be a really big part of the budget, right? And so that means that to fix it, to deal with it, you've got to deal with a big part of the budget to fix it.
Congress is looking at extending the individual tax cuts that expire in, I think, until 2025. There's been talk about moving another bill this year that would make these things permanent. Can you give us a guess on what that would do to the deficit if it's not paid for, like the current bill we just passed is not paid for?
Well, we do have that alternative scenario, fiscal scenario, where we did literally assume that those tax cuts would stay in place, the spending caps would stay in place, the expensing bonus would stay in place. So that is sort of our current policy baseline. And there we see the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio getting to be about 106% of GDP instead of, I think, 96%. So that would have a significant effect.
That would happen immediately, not in the 10-year window?
Oh, it happened over the 10-year window. That's right. That's actually part of the trickiness a little bit, right, about our forecasts, because we're assuming current law. So we have to now worry about, well, do people really believe that the taxes are going to go back up after 2025? How many believe they will be extended? So we have to deal with expectations a little bit. That sort of adds to the uncertainty of our forecast.
Looking at the increase in non-defense discretionary in 2018, the biggest part of that is disaster spending, emergency disaster, $102 billion, I think. That's in budget authority.
Right.
To what extent does that translate into outlays which actually increase the deficit?
Well, under our baseline, we assume that those outlays continue at that level. As part of why under the alternate fiscal scenario, we've taken that down to where we assume that the spending is more like $11 billion a year and let it grow with inflation, because we think that's more realistic. So that's the one way direction where our alternate fiscal scenario would actually help the deficit a little bit, because we don't think that 100 billion is going to continue.
Okay, but just looking at the 100 billion for
Right.
2018, do you assume that all of that budget authority turns into outlays and adds to the deficit? Just from 2018?
Not in 18.
No.
I mean, it would over time.
It would over time. You expect that it would over the 10-year period? Okay.
Gotcha, sorry. Yes.
A quick question on the tax estimates. Can you just explain why it's an 11-year window for the 1.843 trillion versus the 10? Sorry if you did this already.
Oh, you mean why we extended that to 2028?
11 years versus the 10 years.
Goes from 2018 to 2028.
Right. Yeah. Well, this would be the normal part of our forecast would be to take it out that far. This would be our normal budget outlook. We'd take it 2018 to 2028. So there's nothing different about that. It's just probably what was unusual was the estimate earlier was on the old baseline, which was a year earlier.
Good question. I think that inside the report, you guys look at the international provisions of the tax code. I have to credit Richard Rubin for this one from the Journal, and said that you guys found that the international provisions might encourage companies to locate tangible assets overseas. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, so there are provisions of the Act that attempt to try to shift what's been a problem over the years of firms locating certain assets overseas. And so there's particular provisions two in tandem that are intended to try to discourage those locations. And essentially, I try to identify items overseas that have very high returns and treat them differently than other activities. Well, one way to work around a rule of that sort is to put things that have low returns, so that would typically a tangible asset. That is a way to try to soften how much this anti-abuse rule does. And so clearly it's a very complicated set of decisions that multinational companies are confronting as they deal with the new tax law. This is one that I think some observers have felt like may not be working exactly as intended. That said, we're still waiting for guidance from the Internal Revenue Service to sort of actually outline exactly how these rules will be applied. But
it's a global basis.
It's a global basis, and it's looking at, is this activity that a U.S. firm has overseas earning a high return? And if that's what triggers a rule, one way to reduce that is to put something low with the high. And that gives you something that looks like a typical rate of return. That's a perverse incentive, but it is a potential risk as firms try to confront their incentives under the new law.
Relatedly, there's a box in there in which it's estimated that the law will reduce profit shifting by $65 billion a year. Is there a way to translate that to revenues that would be affected?
Not directly. I mean, I think the observation that we're trying to make with some of these is to recognize the fact that these decisions of a large multinational about where to locate certain activities and certainly where to attribute profits have the ability to actually distort economic statistics. And I think the discussion there are pointing out that the fact that you may have these flows as firms unwind activities that they currently attributed to a foreign party. Now, whether that is, clearly that would indicate it's likely to be taxed, but recall, under the new law going forward, the activities of a foreign multinational will not necessarily be subject to tax, except unless it's caught up by these high return asset types of rules. So it's very hard to sort of translate that to a dollar for dollar bottom line impact on revenues.
Yes, this is a little technical, but when you net out the cost of the deficit cost of the tax cut to 1.85 trillion, does that include? Do you try to parcel out the tax cut's effect on interest rates? There's effect on interest rates from the entire legislative changes and other things, but does this try to put that all in the same box? if you get what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, part of the macro feedback estimate is the effect of interest rates and the change in the path of interest rates.
Just, I mean, as a follow-up on that, I think the earlier score of the tax cut was 1.1 trillion, including feedback. So is this a higher estimate of how much it will increase the deficit over 10 years?
Well, it's kind of a different estimate. I just say I don't want to play up comparisons to the early estimate because so much has changed. Right, we have a different economic forecast, stronger economic growth. We have a different baseline. We have some new information. We had some withholding tables, for example, Treasury put out that helped inform things which weren't available earlier. So really, it's just we've taken on more information. It's got a little bit of a different economic forecast. So there are a number of reasons for why the numbers look a little bit different than they did before.
And I believe a number like that also doesn't include the full cost of the debt service of the piece. It had the interest rate effects, but not the full cost of debt service. So it's not an apples-to-apples comparison.
Or?
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's what was being cited, but typically the Joint Committee is not estimating the debt service.
Did not include the debt service numbers.
Correct.
The effective interest of the effective federal borrowing, changes to federal borrowing on debt service. So a conventional score or a dynamic score typically would not incorporate effects on debt service from changes in federal borrowing. But so a conventional score wouldn't incorporate any changes to debt service. A dynamic score would typically incorporate changes in interest rates on debt service. But this is all in. This includes effects on interest rates and changes in federal borrowing.
Thank you.
So we answered all questions. You guys absorbed a big report very quickly.
Maybe some of us didn't get a chance to read it.
Well, you know where we are if you have additional questions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
It goes up to 20. It goes up to 20. It goes up to 22. Sorry. Okay, so what's the... They just spend